Hey guys, welcome back into the Is AI Coming for Your Job podcast, the podcast where we discuss all things AI as it relates to work and life. I am your host, Jack Forrester. Before we get started, you can send your comments or questions to aiandyourjob@gmail.com. Let me know what you do for work and how susceptible you think your job is to being augmented or replaced by AI. Also, please subscribe and rate the show in whatever platform you're using to listen. I want to take just a second and thank specifically our friends in Ireland for listening. We had a significant bump in listeners or engagement over the past few weeks, and a large part of that was due to our friends in Ireland. So thank you for listening. This is, of course, a universal issue. AI will impact everyone, and its impact on work will not discriminate geographically. So it's as important for us here in the U.S. as it is our friends in Ireland, the rest of Europe, and beyond. So let's get into some headlines from the BBC. Quote, Sir Paul McCartney says artificial intelligence has enabled a final Beatles song, end quote. Paul McCartney told an interviewer that AI had been used to, quote, extricate John Lennon's voice from an old demo so he could complete the song. It will be released sometime later this year. The Beatles are pretty well known for embracing new technology in their music, so I guess we shouldn't be surprised here. Apparently, there was a recording of John Lennon, which was rough to listen to, as it was recorded in his apartment in New York. However, the AI technology was able to cut through that rough noise and produce a clearer voice audio from Lennon. This is a use of AI I can get behind, absolutely. It's much more benign than what I had anticipated. This was something that was written and sung by John Lennon, and AI has done the trick of delivering a cleaner product. If they were using, say, an AI tool to generate John Lennon's voice for music he never wrote or was around, I think then you start to question the motive behind it, and then maybe it becomes less meaningful because the AI doesn't have any lived experiences, right? Or doesn't have an emotional connection with the world. And I guess one of the reasons John Lennon resonated so well with listeners is because he conveyed that in such a way that most people who listen to it could identify with it. I'm not sure AI can do the same thing, at least not yet, and hopefully not for a long time, because then we will be living in a different world. Our second headline is from The Independent. Quote, hundreds attend soulless AI-generated church service, end quote. A church in Germany held an AI-generated service over the past weekend. An avatar or AI-generated human-like person was shown on screen and delivered a service of over 40 minutes, which was generated by ChatGPT. The sermons, prayers, and music were all AI-generated. The reception from the folks in attendance at the service was mixed. Some obvious feedback was that the service lacked soul or spirituality or emotion. The service was at a larger church conference or a convention. Part of this convention is to talk about current world affairs, and one of the key subjects this year was AI. These kinds of applications are something we're going to have to spend more and more time thinking about as we begin to anthropomorphize technology, which is essentially a big term for applying human attributes to non-humans. And as the technology gets better and more compelling, we'll have to decide how and where we want the technology to be in our lives. Do we want an AI delivering our church services? An AI can obviously deliver a form of a church service. It did in this instance. But can it actually lead and create genuine relationships with the folks in attendance? Can an AI sympathize with a grieving widow, or can an AI visit and console someone dying of disease? And as robots, and more specifically humanoid-type robots, become more prevalent in society, how much, if at all, will we start to apply those human attributes to them? Or will we simply treat them as the soulless creatures we think at this point in time that they are? You may laugh that off, but these are questions which will have to be answered. Should a humanoid robot have rights? If the technology is perfected and lifelike humanoid robots are in use, the answer might not be as clear as we think. One obvious use of humanoid robots is the market for helping to curb loneliness, which leads us to our next headline. Our third headline comes from Business Insider, quote, "The price we'll pay for our AI future, more loneliness," end quote. From the article, a new report from the U.S. Surgeon General finds that social activities of all kinds have declined, and it compared the health impact of this increasing loneliness to smoking 12 cigarettes a day. My own research found that Americans are in the throes of a friendship recession, with people reporting smaller social circles and fewer close friends. The rising tide of isolation is particularly acute among young people. The time that Americans between the ages of 15 and 24 spend with friends has declined considerably over the past 2 decades, according to the Surgeon General's report, from an average of 2.5 hours a day to just 40 minutes. End quote. Loneliness has been creeping into our digitally linked society for the past decade. COVID only accelerated the issue. We've never been both more connected and less connected at the same time. You have the world at your fingertips in your phone, along with every contact you know, and yet most, if not all, of those relationships are superficial. Even more than that, we refine our online spaces to reflect and reinforce our beliefs, siloing ourselves from any potential contradictions. This is, of course, aided by the algorithms that track our every click and know us better than we know ourselves. From that article, quote, "The release of generative AI has led to an explosion of interest in the potential to integrate AI-driven chatbots into our lives," end quote. We talked previously about the alarming depression rates in teenagers and its direct correlation to their use of the smartphone. What happens when teens have access to AI-created friends or digitally created personalities who know those teens better than they know themselves? The AI will be the echo chambers of all echo chambers. Why have relationships with real people that take work and that come with the risk of being let down when you can have an AI tell you exactly what you want to hear when you want to hear it? Now, I should say that there's some real good that AI can potentially provide when it comes to relationships. There are certainly lonely people in this world, and I'm thinking about elderly folks who have very limited interactions with other people because they're either immobile or in a situation in which they don't have access to relationships others might. I could see an AI companion serving a real purpose here. And while I would hesitate to introduce something like that to a teenager, for whatever reason, elderly folks strike me as someone who could benefit from this technology. But even considering the potential good, it's hard to know where and how to draw the line. Do we want to grant agency to an AI? If an AI is the only relationship you have in the world, you'll most likely come to cherish it and recognize it as more than just a robot or an AI. You may recognize it as something in between. Famed futurist and technologist Ray Kurzweil says that the day will come when robots and humans are totally indistinguishable from one another. So if robots are walking around that look fully human, it will be difficult not to ascribe some sort of humanity to them. So in the long term, perhaps AI will be benevolent for certain demographics when it comes to providing some type of relationship. But in the short term, it's probably not something we should set loose on millennials and Gen Zers who already have a tough time with relationships. And you may be thinking that humanoid robots are a long way off, even if it's 15 or 20 years away. Why worry about it now? Generative AI can assist you as a software with your computer. You can integrate it with your smartphone. So right now, you could create a personality within your phone that could be with you at all times, to be your assistant, to be a companion. There's companion software type companies that exist right now trying to provide this service to make $1 off of it. So to some extent, it's already here. And if I haven't taken this far enough, I came across a tweet a couple of days ago from a writer. His name's Tim Urban, and he said this, quote, "It's pretty clear that lots of people are going to have AI friends and relationships, which probably means there will also be people with AI spouses. And some of those couples will have kids, using a donor, of course. So there will be future kids with one human parent and one AI parent." There's a lot to take in there, but how many questions have to be resolved before we get to that place? I mean, it seems like another world. Our last headline this week is from Bloomberg, quote, "Humans are biased. Generative AI is even worse," end quote. Since ChatGPT was launched in late 2022, stories and reports of bias within generative AI have been making headlines. Generative AI technologies like ChatGPT have an issue with reinforcing common stereotypes. From the article, quote, "Stable Diffusion generates images using AI in response to written prompts. Like many AI models, what it creates may seem plausible on its face, but is actually a distortion of reality. An analysis of more than 5,000 images created with Stable Diffusion found that it takes racial and gender disparities to extremes, worse than those found in the real world," end quote. Common logic would state that through reinforcement learning, which is what these large language models go through to correct behavior, this problem could be handled in short order. However, the problem is that the folks handling this reinforcement learning with large language models have their own inherent biases within them. So how is the problem handled? Do you get parties from all over the political spectrum and those with competing worldviews to work together to help with the reinforcement learning? Perhaps so. In any case, bias from AI will be a black eye for the technology until the issue is resolved, or at the very least, it's not so obvious. So let's talk about UBI, or Universal Basic Income. UBI it's not a new concept. It's been around for centuries in some form or fashion. Martin Luther King even called for a guaranteed income in 1967, saying it was one of the most simple and effective solutions to poverty, noting that its myriad of benefits included, quote, "a host of positive psychological changes inevitably resulting from widespread economic security," end quote. While his goal was to alleviate poverty, this guaranteed income, or UBI, will need to be repurposed for massive job displacement. Certainly, the talk around UBI has heated up since late last year when ChatGPT was launched, but probably the most well-known source on UBI over the last decade was from 2020 presidential candidate Andrew Yang. Here he is on CNN back in 2020. Now, keep in mind, he was running for the presidency at the time, so this conversation is littered with political tropes, but the message stands. Here he is.
Democratic candidate for president joins me now. Thank you very much for being with us. Universal basic income, $1,000 a month for everyone, including, say, Allison Camerata?
Yes, that's exactly right. And we need to make this move because we're in the midst of the greatest economic and technological transformation in the history of our country. The reason why Donald Trump's our president today is that we automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. And my friends in Silicon Valley know full well that we're about to do the same thing to millions of retail workers, call center workers, fast food workers, truck drivers, and on through the economy.
Not to shorthand it, but there are people who joke that this is the robot apocalypse that's coming. You look at automation as a threat to the fabric of the nation, yes?
Yeah, very much so. And you can look around our main streets. 30% of malls and stores are closing in the next 4 years because Amazon is soaking up another $20 billion in commerce every year. So you don't think of that as robots because robots don't just walk into the main street and sit behind the counter. But if you go to an Amazon fulfillment center, you'll see it's wall-to-wall robots. So this is all real. It's not science fiction.
Is Amazon the enemy?
Well, Amazon is a huge winner in this system that we built, and we need to make it so that more people can share in the progress that's being driven by all this innovation.
So universal basic income, $1,000 a month, is an insurance policy against the threat of automation.
Yeah, it helps give tens of millions of Americans a real path forward. And the thing that excites me the most is you can see that it would improve people's health, nutrition, It would elevate graduation rates. It would improve people's mental health. But it would help people make transitions in a time of historic change.
If you get pushed out of a job by automation, how's $12,000 a year going to change your life?
Well, I've looked at the numbers around the country, and I've spent the last 7 years helping create several thousand jobs in the Midwest and the South. And so $1,000 a month would be a game changer for tens of millions of Americans, but it would also lead to 2 million new jobs because of all the economic activity. It would make our labor force much more dynamic because right now a lot of Americans are stuck in place and are having a hard time moving for different opportunities.
Why does the 1% deserve $1,000 a month, as does someone making $35,000 a year?
Well, if you look at our own country, Alaska has had a dividend for the last 38 years, and it's wildly popular in large part because it's universal. So it's not seen as like, oh, you get it, I don't, I'm giving it to you. Instead, it's just a right of citizenship in Alaska. And because of that, it's very popular. We should do the exact same thing in the rest of the country.
Alaska's got about 700,000 people and a lot of oil. America's got what, 350 million people?
Yes.
And a huge national debt. This will add to that.
Well, it won't necessarily, because if you look around, again, one of the big winners from this process is going to be Amazon, and Amazon paid zero in federal taxes last year. So what we have to do is we have to join every other advanced economy and have a value-added tax that would give the American people a tiny slice of every Amazon sale and every Google search.
VAT often adds taxes and burdens on people who don't make that much money. You're talking about purchases on common everyday goods.
Oh, well, you can tailor a VAT so it falls more heavily on, let's say, luxury goods than consumer staples. But we need to make this kind of move because if you have things like artificial intelligence, right now our income tax system will do a very, very poor job of getting some of those resources in the hands of the American people.
So he was really having this conversation back in 2019 and 2020. So for that reason, I think he is certainly ahead of his time. And that $1,000 figure he was citing was sort of arbitrary to get the conversation started. Like the interviewer said, if your job is automated away, will $12,000 a year make that much of a difference for you? Well, it is a start. But if we're headed to a place in which people will be working significantly less or not at all, something altogether different will have to take place in order for the economies to maintain their current state or something similar to it. I've watched a few of Andrew Yang's interviews and debates from that race, that presidential race, and people would openly laugh or chuckle at his comments on UBI. I think he's going to prove to be prophetic down the road. Now, I know the concept of UBI will rankle some, especially those on the right in the U.S., the idea of another social safety net, especially with debt and deficit levels being where they are, will not go over well. But if the studies being released on a regular basis about job automation prove to be even half right, UBI will begin to demand more and more attention. Additionally, one could argue that UBI was practiced on a large scale during COVID when the U.S. government sent checks out periodically to all its citizens. I'm not sure how many of those folks who would scoff at the idea of UBI returned their checks they received during COVID. And to be fair, that instance was not without consequence. It came at a massive cost and only exacerbated inflation as we added trillions of dollars to our debt. Programs like UBI will obviously require tremendous revenue for the government to be able to distribute these types of funds. Estimates are in the trillions for the amount of value that AI will create over the coming decades. But will that value be recognized in time for the government to institute some sort of UBI for those impacted in the short term by job loss? That's the trillion-dollar question. It's not likely, given that companies are already announcing hiring freezes and they are already announcing projected layoffs over the next 3 years. Think about our examples from previous episodes, because they see the efficiencies of AI and what AI can do for them. Certainly in the meantime and short term, most of those people will be able to transition to other positions or other trades. But as things get moving with more and more steam, I'm not confident that our cumbersome governing entities will be able to react in a timely manner. We'll see. And there are some small pockets around the world in which UBI programs are being trialed right now. I'll link to an article from The Guardian that highlights 2 towns in England currently undergoing these trials. These trials are essentially to measure the effectiveness and mental health of those in the program. And I should also mention that Sam Altman, the CEO of ChatGPT, or OpenAI, the maker of ChatGPT, is funding an effort to research the effects of UBI. So at the very least, these people who are in the business of creating this technology, which will displace workers, are aware of the effects at least, and they are at least trying to find a path forward. So I wanted to answer a few listener questions today. The first one is, who are you? We don't know much about you other than a few minor things you've mentioned previously. And that's a good question. And I would say that's calculated. I enjoy my anonymity and want to maintain it as much as possible. I know that seems like a wild idea in the time we live in, but I do enjoy my quiet life as it stands. And I don't think knowing more specifics about me will help the conversation. I will say that I'm in the southeastern U.S. I'm a middle-aged father with a wife and a child. I work in a white-collar job, which will eventually be susceptible to being outright replaced by AI. My concerns stem largely from being a father and a husband. I know intimately just how much fathers think about these types of issues and what their concerns are. Few things are anxiety inducing as the potential of losing your livelihood and not being able to provide for your family. I think most men and women working to support their families can certainly identify with that. So the second question is, do you worry that you're peddling in fear? And I would say yes, very much so. I myself am fearful of what's to come as it relates to work, but peddling fear is not my intent. And if you knew me personally, you would know that that's not who I am. I know the name of the podcast itself invokes fear, and I'm not crazy about it, and it wasn't my first, second, or third choice, but it's where we ended up. And again, this is obviously not a money-making venture, so there really is no incentive to stoke fear. I'm not telling you anything that's new. I'm only presenting the information that's already available in a way that I think it's digestible. This is the state of things, and this is where things are going. And my only hope is to help people know that this is coming, and hopefully they'll be ready and able to pivot when the time comes. And not just as it relates to work. I mean, this technology, if you listen to the previous episodes, our world's going to change pretty dramatically over the next few decades if this technology continues as most folks think it will. So for those reasons, I think it's important to have these conversations. And more specifically for folks who don't work in tech. I don't work in tech, so I just have an interest in this very specific topic, and I'm hoping to help people who don't speak, tech very well to be able to understand it. Our last question this week is, if the risks are what they are with AI, why are companies proceeding with AI research? So this is the obvious question. I think the best answer I've heard on it comes from MIT AI researcher Max Tegmark. We talked about him previously. He wrote the book AI Life 3.0, and he's generally thought of as a leader in AI research. Here he is. He's on the This is from the Lex Friedman podcast discussing this very thing, and I'm going to play a large chunk of this interview that talks about why AI research labs are continuing with this research in the face of the risk. So here's Max on the Lex Friedman podcast.
That improves everything. Or a lot of little leaps here and there because so much of this is out in the open also. So many smart people are looking at this and trying to figure out little leaps here and there. And it becomes this sort of collective race where a lot of people feel if I don't take the leap, someone else will. And it is actually very crucial for the other part of it. Why do we want to slow this down? So again, what this open letter is calling for is just pausing all training of systems that are more powerful than GPT-4 for 6 months. Give a chance for the labs to coordinate a bit on safety and for society to adapt, give the right incentives to the labs. Because you've interviewed a lot of these people who lead these labs, and just as well as I do that they're good people. They're idealistic people. They're doing this first and foremost because they believe that AI has a huge potential to help humanity. And but at the same time, they are trapped in this horrible race to the bottom. Have you read Meditations on Moloch by Scott Alexander?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a beautiful essay on this poem by Ginsberg where he interprets it as being about this monster. It's this game theory monster that pits people against each other in this race to the bottom where everybody ultimately loses.
Yes.
And the evil thing about this monster is, even though everybody sees it and understands, they still can't get out of the race, right? A good fraction of all the bad things that we humans do are caused by Moloch. And I like Scott Alexander's naming of the monster, so we humans can think of it as a thing. If you look at why do we have overfishing, why do we have more generally the tragedy of the commons? Why is it that to Liv Bourret, I don't know if you had her on your podcast.
Yeah, she's become a friend. Yeah,
great. She made this awesome point recently that beauty filters that a lot of female influencers feel pressure to use are exactly Moloch in action again. First, nobody was using them, and people saw them just the way they were. And then some of them started using it and becoming ever more plastic fantastic. And then the other ones that weren't using it started to realize that if they want to just keep their market share, they have to start using it too. And then you're in a situation where they're all using it. And none of them has any more market share or less than before. So nobody gained anything. Everybody lost. And they have to keep becoming ever more plastic fantastic also, right? And but nobody can go back to the old way because it's just too costly, right? Moloch is everywhere. And Moloch is not a new arrival on the scene either. We humans have developed a lot of collaboration mechanisms to help us fight back against Moloch through various kinds of constructive collaboration. The Soviet Union and the United States did sign a number of arms control treaties against Moloch, who was trying to stoke them into unnecessarily risky nuclear arms races, et cetera, et cetera. And this is exactly what's happening on the AI front. This time, it's a little bit geopolitics, but it's mostly money, where there's just so much commercial pressure. If you take any of these leaders of the top tech companies, if they just say, this is too risky, I want to pause for 6 months, they're going to get a lot of pressure from shareholders and others. But like, well, if you pause, but those guys don't pause, we don't want to get our lunch eaten.
Yeah.
And shareholders even have the power to replace the executives in the worst case, right? So we did this open letter because we want to help these idealistic tech executives to do what their heart tells them by providing enough public pressure on the whole sector to just pause so that they can all pause in a coordinated fashion. And I think without the public pressure, none of them can do it alone, push back against their shareholders, no matter how good-hearted they are. So Moloch is a really powerful foe.
So the idea is for the major developers of AI systems like this, so we're talking about Microsoft, Google, Meta, and anyone else?
Well, OpenAI is very close with Microsoft, now, of course, yes. And there are plenty of smaller players. For example, Anthropic is very impressive. There's Conjecture. There's many players. I don't want to make a long list to leave anyone out. For that reason, it's so important that some coordination happens, that there's external pressure on all of them, saying you all need to pause. Because then the people, the researchers in these organizations, the leaders who want to slow down a little bit, they can say to their shareholders, everybody's slowing down because of this pressure, and it's the right thing to do. If you live in an Orwellian dystopia, what do you care who created it, right? And if it goes farther and we just lose control even to the machines, so that it's not us versus them, it's us versus it. What do you care who created this unaligned entity, which has goals different from humans ultimately, and we get marginalized, we get made obsolete, we get replaced. That's what I mean when I say it's a suicide race. It's kind of like we're rushing towards this cliff, but the closer to the cliff we get, the more scenic the views are, and the more money there is there, and so we keep going. But we have to also stop at some point, right? Quit while we're ahead, and it's a suicide race. It cannot be won. But the way to really benefit from it is to continue developing awesome AI a little bit slower, so we make it safe, make sure it does the things that humans want, and create a condition where everybody wins.
So there you have it from Max Tegmark. That's why AI research labs are proceeding as they are in the face of this risk and uncertainty. If Company A stops their AI research, Company B could very well beat them to the punch with a technology that puts them out of business. And that's why we are where we are. So that's it for this week. Next time, we're going to look at AI investment, exactly who is putting in the capital into AI research labs and why. But in the meantime, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. You can do it with just a few clicks in the app you're using at this very moment. And if you want to be more deliberate, you can share this episode via text or email to friends in your circle. Thanks for listening. We'll talk next time.